We're here at Hallwalls talking to Jesse Weber about his exhibition, You Can't Smoke in Here, Mr.Corbusier, You'll Burn This Mother Down. And I wanted to start by saying, you know, when I moved to Buffalo, it was really funny because people would talk to me and they would say, have you seen the grain elevators? Have you seen the grain elevators? And I would think, well, yeah, I've seen grain elevators before, yeah. And I thought it was always kind of intriguing how, you know, psychologically and emotionally connected people were to them.
Yeah.
And then I invited you to propose a project, and sure enough, you did a project on grain elevators.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's you know, I don't habitually propose shows to necessarily involve the city on purpose, you know. But like, you know, when you proposed it, and I start looking up kind of like what is Buffalo, what goes on there culturally, the grain elevators pop up pretty immediately, you know. And that kind of becomes the connection between Buffalo and me. For me, is like I'm really interested in modernism, but kind of when it goes awry, like after the fact. Sort of not necessarily like the funeral party for the death of the you know, utopian part of that, but when it kind of does things that weren't really planned by its creators.
Like what would be an example of that?
Like, well, you know, like I was looking on eBay the other day for these fiberglass Eames chairs, which I'm really interested in, like the Eames as far as their idea as designers, but then like the actuality. And you have these kind of like perfect formed fiberglass chairs that are really beautiful, really kind of poetic on their own as forms. But sometimes I'll look and find them on eBay where they've been converted into like church pews, which to me are like really amazing and beautiful. And like, I think the Eames, if they aren't happy about that, they should be, you know? So that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in, where the actual user sort of takes part in the design, where they sort of have a hand in, this is what this needs to be for me, this suits my need. So I guess that may be kind of like a comparison. Maybe.
Now, how do you relate that to the grain elevators in their history?
Well, I mean, there are these things that, well, actually, you know, when you look up, one of the first things I did is like look up Buffalo on Wikipedia, which is becoming like the reference to everything now. And there's this quote by Corbusier where he basically, about a trip that he made in the early part of the century, where he's basically talking about like, this is the future of architecture in America. And then like the timing's kind of important to that, because like that's just prior to the Depression. So at the time there was this boom, there was this energy, there was this kind of like promise for this area, but then it sort of goes to pot just a few years later, you know, for economic reasons. And these things kind of end up getting abandoned over time. They, you know, when they're empty, they have a tendency to explode from the dust. So for me, this is where that kind of like dysfunctional part of the form and function debate comes in. So for me, that's kind of like the entry level of, you know, what can I do that has something to do with Buffalo, I guess.
Well, now knowing some of your work previously, it's obvious to me that with the grain elevators, one of the aspects that must have drawn you is their form.
Yeah.
Just the basic sort of formal quality of them. Because they kind of, once you reduce them in a way and take away the details, they do exist as these pretty spectacular kind of modernist forms, right?
Yeah, they're amazing. I mean, they're huge sculptures that are like kind of too perfect to be real sculptures on their own, you know? Like nobody intended, you know, I guess the design probably is purely about function. Like, how do we make these things work as machines, you know, these buildings, how do we make them kind of living machines? Which is sort of like, you know, like holds true to the modernist spirit. But then they're a really different thing at this point, you know? Like you drive around and you look at them, and it's not that they're sad, but there's like a sort of like, you sort of see where things went wrong, I guess, at this point. And Buffalo seems to sort of embrace that and have kind of like a special place in their heart for that. It's kind of like the double-edged sword. It's like, you know, we were almost there, but it is still here, and there is something that's still there that's, you know, doesn't exist everywhere else. Buffalo is like really specific.
Well, with Buffalo, it's more like we were there.
Yeah,
and then the question is whether we'll ever get back there.
Yeah.
Now because people have done lots of different work with grain elevators, so let's talk about your decision of what you decided to do with them, particularly in the prints.
Well, I mean, I think that,
And we should point out these are silkscreen prints.
yeah, these are silkscreen prints. They're made from photos, which aren't my photos. They're not original photos. So I'm working with photos that are made by some pretty well-known documental photographers.
But you've reduced what I think is really nice, particularly since they're silkscreens, is that the images are really been reduced to lines.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like, it's kind of the play of like form. When does form become meaning? Do you know what I'm saying? And I guess that probably holds true with my work in general. So it's not so much just I'm not really interested in sort of like fetishizing form and leaving it at that. But I think there's kind of like a, sort of a weird conceptual thing that happens when you make these things a little bit cruder or sort of debase them. And then, my addition to this is pretty minimalist, but there's sort of some distortion that happens, So for me, like adding these lines that are similar, but just a little bit off, where you get these kind of moire patterns that take place, is where like sort of beauty in these things happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I do something that's similar, but not quite, like it's not a complete match, and it causes this sort of visual distortion to take place. It's like, I don't know, to me that's kind of where the beauty of these things are.
Well, what's really funny about that is that, as I use that as an example, is that when you first told me about it, you were indicating that you wanted to do the sort of double printing of lines so that visually for the viewer who's standing in front of it, you get to a certain distance and there is a moire effect created. And yet weirdly, there's a moire that came out in the printing.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, and that's, that's something that happens in silkscreen that photo just isn't capable of. And the funny thing is, it's like, that's usually sort of like a horrific thing in silkscreen. Like I work professionally in silkscreen, like in the most unartistic way possible.
And that's an error.
Yeah, and that's like, oh, you've got a moire, we've got to rethink this completely. Right. But it's like when, I stand behind a machine making the same image as perfectly as I can for hours and hours on end. So when you're doing that, there's sort of like, there's a beauty in the flaw and in the mistakes. Like that becomes sort of like special because everything else is so much the same that it's not important, It's like you're just going through the motions. So I guess maybe in a weird way, like my professional habits sort of influence, what I do, for my own artistic career. So.
Now in interviewing you, we are taking you away from the painting process for the one sculptural piece in the show. Why don't we talk about this for a sec, though? Because it was probably I think from the work you originally sent me, it was really mostly sculptural that I saw. So let's talk about the piece a bit.
Okay. Well, I mean, this thing is sort of in process the way it stands right now. And within 24 hours, it'll be completely covered in rust and oxidized, we hope, right? Yeah, but I think
it will be.
It will be.
What kind of attitude is we hope?
No, it will. It will. So, this is this kind of like it's a grain elevator form, but it's been sort of reduced down to pure form. I mean,
it's reduced about as much as you could reduce it, I think.
For it to be recognizable.
Yeah.
And then, I think that the oxidation sort of stands for some of this like beautiful decay. These things that happen that aren't intentional, that when things get sort of abandoned or left behind, that are maybe more aesthetically more pleasing in a weird way than the way they were meant to be. Mm-hmm. So in that way, it's pretty similar to the prints in a weird way.
We were just talking to Curator because you and she are showing at the same time here at Hallwalls, and it's really kind of, aside from the rather hysterical fact that we have a lot of orange in the gallery, which is kind of coincidental. What started to fascinate me yesterday as we were putting the works up is that the works share a kind of otherworldly ambiance. Even, the silk screens of the grain elevators they do have a kind of, ethereal's not the right word and alien's not the right word, but
Right.
it's something like that.
Something sort of foreign, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. It's like
It's like they're imbued, or you've imbued them with a kind of, not quite a supernatural quality, but a different, you know, they're recognizable as what they are, but at the same time they have a kind of aura
yeah.
about them that is different,
Yeah.
and
Well-
that alludes to, you know,
Well, I mean, I think that that's just sort of like the space that art occupies. And that's really different for me than the way that like documental photography works or functions or is intended, you know. And that's, you know, I don't want these things to be photographs, and I don't want them to be definitely not you know, these are not explosions that ever took place, and they don't even
Right.
look like realistic explosions.
Right.
But like this idea that I can conceptually make these things explode through my own minimalist gestures is kind of like, that's the space, that's the difference between art and documentation for me. So maybe that's part of where that comes through, which is like, I mean, it's a pretty, to me, that's a pretty special place, you know? Like,
well, let's talk about the minimalist gesture for a sec, because
Yeah.
the one thing that's really interesting that's been more and more interesting to me over time as a curator over the years is that I've noticed I've gotten more and increasingly impressed with the less is more quotient.
Yeah.
You know, because I think it's the most difficult thing to do is to reduce the number of gestures, but still have the impact you're looking for or the
Yeah.
effect you're looking for. And it's clear that in all the work of yours that I've seen that in the end there is like kind of a minimal kind of gestural
Yeah.
activity going on.
Yeah,
You
well-
never get the sense that you're overdoing it or trying too hard to make,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like if they become too laborious, then it's work, you know? And that sort of takes away from
From the play of art.
yeah, you know, so some of that, you know, like, for example, in this series, it's like I knew that I could make these moires happen, right? But I didn't know, and there's no way to know exactly how those are going to happen until you actually print them. So you've sort of got like one shot, but you know it's going to happen, and you know it's going to be beautiful, and you know that it's going to be along the lines of what you wanted.
Yeah.
But that's where it's like, you can think something out and you can plan it all you want to, but in the end, for me at least, what drives the art making process is some of these things that you don't know before you do it, and sort of makes it, you know, honestly, that's what makes my actions kind of worth my time and effort and labor, you know.
Can you tell us anything about any upcoming work or things that you're thinking about?
No, I'm kind of in between stuff right now. But, you know, that's kind of how it works. Like, I end up working on, you know, very few shows a year that kind of occupy a lot of my time, a lot of my money, a lot of my space, you know. And, you know, I never know exactly what's going to be the next thing. So they're not ever really, really planned out. But they keep happening, and they will keep happening, you know, I'm pretty confident of that. So, no, I mean, there's not a part 2 or anything coming up.
Right.
But there'll be something. And it's not that they necessarily, you know, from one body of work to the next, it's not that they're ever connected in any way more than sort of my own aesthetic, my own sort of concept of what needs to be done to things. So, you know, in a weird way, if you look at like a line of my work, it probably looks a little bit schizophrenic, like aesthetically maybe. But to me, they're always really related, you know, on the basis of a concept or sort of like a concern, I guess.
But following a little bit more of an intuitive trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise, you know, it's like I said, it becomes work. It's like, that's the difference in planning out the things you need to do and doing the things that you want to do for me, which is, to me, that's really important to have that separation. And, you know, maybe some of that comes from working in screen print for this many years. You know, I don't want my work, and what I do as artistic work to be the same. Like, you know, frightens the shit out of me to think that that ever would be the same. So, you know.
Well, hopefully you don't get too frightened and you can keep those things separate.
A little bit of fear is good, right?
Well, thanks for coming to Hallwalls and bringing your
me.
work here. It's been great to have you, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk about it a bit.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you guys.